Kara used to be normal, rational, reasonable. She had always been wary of things like spiders, strange noises in the dark, and snakes, things people feared for good reason. But she never went into hysterics or felt paralyzed when confronted with them. When her husband came home from a month-long trip the night of the incident, she noticed slight differences in his manner and his physical demeanor. While his stare was a little distant and his face pale, he greeted her with a kiss and a smile. She chalked this detached manner up to the long flight from Africa, where he worked as a doctor in some godforsaken part of the jungle. She'd wished he'd just take a job at a local hospital, but learned a long time ago that Sam would never truly settle down. They ate dinner. He avoided her questions about his trip by asking how she'd been while he was away, and then he listened as she relayed the argument she had with the phone company man over their cell service.
"Tell him we aren't paying for service that only works a few days a month,"
he'd said.
I did tell him that.
Good.
He said it's a problem in the phones, not with the service. We have to contact the manufacturer to have them replaced.
Sam had sighed, pressed his stomach, and then pushed his plate away.
"I'm feeling kind of shitty. We'll talk about this in the morning. I'll call them myself. Get it sorted out or switch providers."
What's wrong?
"I don't know."
He stood, still holding his belly, and walked towards the stairs.
Flu, probably.
Maybe you should go to the hospital. Might have picked up a virus over there.
He shook his head.
We get physicals before going home. It's nothing serious, or they'd have detected it. I just need some sleep.
Kara cleared the table, washed the dishes, and then read the remainder of a book she'd started the night before. Finally, a little after midnight, she'd gone to bed. Sam slept soundly, which was unusual. He snored most nights, and his nose made a distinct clicking sound if he wasn't snoring. She climbed into bed, careful to avoid disturbing him, and then laid her head on her pillow. For several minutes, Kara laid there, listening for the sound of his breathing. When she couldn't hear it, panic twisted her belly. She touched his arm. He felt warm. That was good, she told herself. Something deep in her brain warned against it, but Kara moved closer. She touched his chest while lifting herself on her elbow to peer down at his face. His chest didn't move. His face showed no reaction at all to her touch. Sam was usually a light sleeper. Panic turned to fear. She shook him. He didn't respond.
Sam!
She pushed him onto his back, listened to his chest, and then a sob escaped her lips as she discerned a faint, alarmingly slow heartbeat. She reached across him for his phone, which he'd set on the nightstand. Hands shaking, Kara dialed 911, then put the phone to her ear. Nothing. God damn it, their piece of shit phone company. She pounded on Sam's chest, hoping to jumpstart his heart, or whatever pounding on a person's chest did to make them wake up. Sam's lips puckered, his cheeks ballooned. She held her breath, heard a gurgling sound in his belly, and then jumped a little. When his eyes opened, he stared at her, but Kara could tell he didn't see her. In the blue of his irises, something moved. She leaned forward, parted his eyelids so she could see better, and frowned.
What the?
Yellowish lines moved within his iris, almost like worms. They twisted and turned, straightened and then curled. What were they? She picked up the phone again. The blue line at the top showed 4 full bars. Finally, a signal. As she pressed the call icon, Sam jerked. Still leaning over him, Kara touched his chest, hoping to reassure him. He jerked again, and she dropped the phone. She heard it clatter on the floor as Sam opened his mouth. Kara had little time to think, much less react, as yellow fluid gushed from Sam's lips. It shot from him as water might from a hose, soaking her face and body with its warmth. She gasped as the bitter fluid filled her mouth. Something moved on her tongue. She quickly spat it out. She jumped from the bed, slipping on a puddle of vomit that found its way to the floor. Her knee hit the wood hard. She gasped as pain rocketed through her leg, but scrambled to her feet, and then rushed to the door. She flipped the light switch up. The light burned her eyes a little, and she couldn't process what she saw at first. Tiny yellow worms wriggled everywhere. Thousands of them covered Sam's chest, his face, the floor. She glanced down at herself.
Shit!
Kara swatted at the worms, squirming all over her nightshirt, her arms, neck, and in her hair. She felt them tickling her back as she picked up the phone. The screen was shattered. Her phone was downstairs. She didn't want to leave Sam, who still retched, although no more worm-filled vomit left his lips. But she had to call an ambulance. She rushed downstairs, retrieved her phone from its charger in the kitchen, and cried when she saw that it had no signal. Sam roared upstairs. The sound was animalistic. Kara ran to the front door. She felt the cold grass sting her feet as she crossed into her neighbor's yard. She rushed up their front steps, then banged on the door. Gina didn't answer right away. Kara didn't blame her. They lived in a quiet neighborhood, but most of them kept to themselves. Late-night callers were uncommon. Finally, she saw lights in the glass panel next to the door. Gina peered through the window, scowled, and then opened the door.
Kara, what's wrong? It's Sam. My phone's not working. I need an ambulance. Okay.
Gina stepped back.
Come inside. I'll call one for you. What's on your shirt? Worms?
Gina frowned.
Looks like puke.
Kara looked down. The worms were gone. She touched her hair. Still felt them squirming against her scalp. She tried to pluck them out, but only managed to remove a few clumps of her hair. Sobbing, she scratched her head. Her nails scratched the skin, but when she pulled her hands away, she saw only blood. No worms. Gina was talking, phone to her ear. Kara felt dizzy.
Just sit,
Gina said.
Help is on its way. Sam,
Kara said.
He's got thousands of them on him. God, they're probably all over me too. Worms?
She nodded. It was hard to keep her eyes open. She felt so weak.
Everywhere. Shush,
Gina said.
Let's get you cleaned up, okay?
As Gina helped her up, Kara swayed. The wall turned into the ceiling, and then the room began to swirl. Sam was dead by the time the paramedics arrived. Kara slept through it all. She woke in the hospital 2 days later. Disoriented, she'd asked for Gina, and then the doctor. He assured her she was fine. She wasn't. Not when the worms were still out there, waiting to infect her, as they had Sam. Maybe the doctors killed them. She didn't know Sam was dead at that point, and clung to the hope they'd go home, and it'd all be like a bad dream.
Did you kill the worms?
She asked.
Where did they come from?
We found no worms on you or your husband,
The doctor said.
Where is he?
He suffered a massive stroke. I'm sorry, but he didn't make it.
His words made her heart ache, but the fear that the worms were still out there, waiting, overwhelmed her sadness.
He threw up so many of them. Must have been in his brain, too. That's what killed him. Did you check his brain?
He smiled. The vomit we analyzed contained nothing but his dinner. We examined his stomach contents too. Nothing there either. They're still investigating, though.
They had to go somewhere. Worms just don't vanish.
You may have suffered a hallucination brought on by shock. The autopsy will tell us if there was anything in his brain, though.
I saw them.
Kara insisted.
They were in his eyes.
The doctor reached into his pocket, pulled out a syringe, and then pushed whatever fluid was inside into Kara's IV line. You need to rest, dear. Once your body recovers from the shock, everything will feel less confusing.
I know what I saw,
she said, as sleep blanketed her brain.
Worms everywhere.
Kara spent a total of 5 days in the hospital. By day 3, she'd stopped talking about the worms, because no one believed her, and she tried to put it out of her mind. She even tried to accept what they told her, but the dread persisted. The hospital psychologist told her it wasn't unusual for trauma victims to develop irrational fears, such as the fear that the worms would infest her body, as they had Sam's. But these were temporary and would fade as she recovered. He said that her mind, unable to accept Sam's stroke, might have manufactured the worms, so that she had a reason for his tragic and unexpected death. Kara knew what she saw but didn't argue. He prescribed a sedative to calm her down, and then told her he'd see her after she had time to rest at home. Gina was quiet as she drove Kara away from the hospital 2 days later. She said nothing as they waited at stoplights and then turned down the street, but Kara could tell she wanted to speak. She pulled into her own driveway and then walked with Kara to the home she and Sam purchased just 2 years before. Kara opened the front door, took a deep breath, and then walked inside. Gina followed. Although she preferred to deal with the worms alone, Kara said nothing as Gina closed the door behind them. She could still smell vomit. The odor wasn't strong, but it clung to the air, teasing her nostrils.
I have to clean up. I wanted to do that for you,
Gina said.
But the police didn't finish up until this morning. Sorry. It's okay. I'll find the worms and then you'll all see I'm telling the truth.
A sigh, but Gina said no more.
You can go,
Kara said.
I'll be fine. I'll stay for a bit, help you clean up.
She didn't argue. When Gina saw them, maybe she'd stop treating her like a mental patient. Kara went upstairs. As she approached her bedroom, the vomit stench became powerful. She opened the door and then stood there, staring at the puke-stained sheets. It had dried on the hardwood floor as well, forming a crusty, whitish shell. Sam's pillow still held the indent of his head, and the mattress sunk slightly where his body had lain. Tears threatened to spill, but Kara blinked them away. She had work to do. She could grieve for Sam once she proved he didn't have a stroke. Keeping her eyes on the floor, just in case a rogue worm waited somewhere to strike at her, she approached the bed. Gingerly, she lifted the sheets. Nothing but dried vomit. No worms. Not even a chunk of the food they said he puked up. She pulled the sheet from the bed and then tossed it on the floor. Then she tossed the blanket and the fitted sheet, and then Sam's pillow. The pile covered the spot on the floor which was probably ruined by the vomit. The mattress had stained as well.
I should burn it all. I know it's hard,
Gina said behind her.
But we'll get it cleaned up. If you don't want the bed, I can help you get a new one. We'll get through this, hun. Hun?
Kara bit her lip to stop the snide remarks gathering in her brain. She left the bedroom, pushing Gina aside so she could go back downstairs. She saw Sam's shattered phone on the counter next to her own. Useless piece of shit. She picked both up and then walked to the garbage can next to the fridge. She stepped on the lever to open the lid. On top of the remains of their dinner, several white worms wriggled. An icy chill crept into her blood. Kara felt it travel through her veins to her heart. and then it flowed back out, permeating every pore. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. Everything stopped as she watched the wretched things move through the bits of raw meat and rotting vegetables.
Kara?
Gina was behind her.
Oh, shit.
Kara realized she hadn't breathed for some time. When she managed to draw air into her lungs, it stung like a swarm of angry bees beating against her chest. She stumbled back, clutching the phones to her chest.
Get them out.
Gina opened the garbage bin and then lifted the bag.
It's okay, just maggots. You're safe, Kara.
A sob left Kara's lips. It was followed by another.
Get them out!
She screamed.
Out!
As Gina quickly removed the bag containing the worms, Kara sank to the floor. She shook. Sweat trickled down her back, but she felt so cold. She pulled her knees to her chest and felt marginally better. When Gina returned to the kitchen, Kara had started to rock herself.
Kara, they killed him. He had a stroke, hun. Go. Kara? Get out of my house! You're grieving, sweetie. It'll pass. Get out! Please! Thank you for trying to help, but I need to be alone. Okay,
Gina said.
I'll come back in a few hours to check on you. Please get some rest.
Kara didn't reply. She waited until she heard the door open and then close. Then she stood, tossed the phones on the floor, and returned to her bedroom. She crawled along the floor, examining the cracks between the floorboards, the trim, and in the fibers of the rug that laid at the end of their bed. Nothing. Not a single worm. She looked at the bed. Has anyone checked underneath? Kara stood. She lifted the mattress and pushed it until she flipped it on its side. Nothing. She lifted the box spring and then pushed it against the mattress. They made a loud thud as they fell against the opposite wall. Still, nothing. She investigated every piece of furniture in her bedroom. When she found nothing inside, beneath or behind, she retrieved Sam's hammer and a hatchet from the garage. She chopped up the nightstand, and then the headboard. The dressers followed, and then she stood, surveying the mess she'd made. If they weren't in the furniture or hiding behind it, they had to be. She stared at the floor. Worms were tiny, no bones. They could get anywhere, even under the floorboards. The idea of those things living, breeding, and flourishing beneath her feet, beneath her walls, infesting her home, moving through the heating vents, waiting for a chance to nest inside her, chilled Kara to the bone. She couldn't live in this house anymore. Couldn't sell it either. Not with a worm infestation waiting to kill the next occupant. She could pull up the floorboards, she supposed. Find them, kill them, and then it'd all be okay. She didn't want to see them, though. Each time she took apart a piece of furniture and found nothing, she felt relief. However, not finding them squashed that brief sense of peace almost immediately. If they weren't there, they were somewhere, waiting, watching. Something tickled her scalp. Kara scratched it. The tickle moved to a spot just behind her ear. She scratched that, felt around for the culprit, but came up with nothing.
Oh no,
she whispered. They were on her. That's where they hid. She ran to the bathroom. The mirror revealed nothing, but her scalp still tickled. So did her arms and her back. Kara stripped down, turned, and then ran her hands all over her skin. Nothing. Must have migrated to her hair. She opened the vanity drawer, retrieved Sam's electric shaver, and then turned it on. Piece by piece, she carefully shaved the hair from her head. It dropped in clumps into the sink where she examined each for worms. Nothing. Finally, completely bald, Kara was satisfied they hadn't hidden on her body. That meant her original theory that they hid within the floors and walls was right. She dressed, and then retrieved the hatchet from the floor. As she hacked at the wood, she tried not to panic at the tickling sensation she felt on every part of her body. The idea that one of them touched her, crawled on her, caused an ache in her chest. She couldn't bear it. She had to get rid of them. Sweating, head pounding, Kara stood back, hatchet in hand, and surveyed the room. The floor was open along with the bed, but she found nothing except a dead mouse and lots of cobwebs. She knew what she saw that night, though. Sam's eyes continued to haunt her. She didn't imagine it. The worms were there. They killed him, and they'd kill her. She didn't need anyone to believe her anymore. She knew the truth. She had to get rid of them. The gasoline smothered the smell of vomit. It burned Kara's nostrils, made her eyes water. All day and well into the night, long after Gina had checked on her. She turned off the lights and didn't answer the door. Kara laid on the sofa, thinking of ways to rid herself of the worms. If they weren't in the floors or on her body, she figured they must be in the walls, or within the wood and stone of the house itself. She tried to rest, close her eyes for a few minutes like the doctor advised. But every time she did so, Kara saw the worms. They laughed at her, taunted her, whispered promises of what was to come. They'd kill her and anyone who came into the house after she was gone. She had one option: burn it all. Beginning with her bedroom, Kara soaked walls, floors, and furniture with gasoline she'd retrieved from the garden shed. She had to siphon more from her car to finish soaking the downstairs as well. The smell made her dizzy, so she covered her face with a dish towel as she searched the kitchen drawers for the matches Sam kept in case the pilot went out on the furnace. The gas furnace. Kara looked at the stove, also gas-fueled. She crossed the short distance from the drawer to the stove, turned each knob, letting the vapor fill the kitchen. Then she walked out, down the hallway, through the living room, and to the front door. She stood on the threshold as she struck a match, and then tossed it inside the box to ignite the remaining matches. Taking a breath, she threw the flaming box inside and then backed away. The front rooms caught almost immediately. Kara felt the heat pressing her face as she backed down the porch steps and felt the grass beneath her bare feet. Something popped, cracked, and then a whooshing sound filled the quiet night air. She heard doors slam, people yelled, probably worried for her safety. When Kara reached the sidewalk, she let herself breathe.
Survive that, you little bastards.
Gina called her name. Kara raised her hand to wave, so Gina knew she was okay and felt her bladder constrict. There, behind the knuckle of her index finger, was a long, yellowish line. She couldn't breathe. It wriggled downward, over her hand, to her wrist. She opened her mouth. She didn't hear herself scream, but she felt the pavement when it struck her head.
She said something about a worm,
Gina said from somewhere far away.
I tried to tell her there wasn't one, but she clawed at her arm and then she fell. I think she's lost it.
Her husband's death has affected her ability to reason,
A man said. He, too, sounded far away.
She believes what she's saying, so we have to treat it as real.
But it's not. They didn't find any worms.
Yes, but she sees them clearly enough to warrant burning her house down. First, we have to calm her. Later, we can work towards addressing the fear so she can get past it. Then we can begin helping her cope with reality.
Kara's arm itched. Her eyes felt strange, sort of tickly. She lifted her hand, felt heavier than it should, but she managed to rub her eyes. The tickling sensation persisted.
She's awake,
Gina said.
Kara, honey, how are you feeling?
Kara didn't care about Gina or the doctor, or what they thought made her see the worms. She knew what she saw. Her belly gurgled, something twisted, clutched at her insides, and then pulled. She gasped, still rubbing at her eyes.
Kara!
Gina said. Hands grabbed at her, pinned her down. A man yelled something. She couldn't understand what he said. The realization of what was happening held her focus. She didn't find the worms in her home because they weren't in the house. They were in her. Kara opened her mouth to say something, warn them, but no sound came out. Instead, something rose through her stomach. It warmed her chest, clogged her throat, and then pushed out of her.
She's crashing!
A woman said.
Ugh, Christ, that's a lot of vomit.
A man whispered.
What are those worms?
The force of the vomit exploding from her body made it impossible to breathe. Her head ached, burned, and her eyes felt wet. Something leaked from them. She couldn't see more than a blur of color, heard only a cacophony of sound as people bumped, poked, and stabbed at her. Then, everything stopped. Gina was pissed. 3 days she'd been trapped in a goddamn room with a doctor who'd worked on Kara and 2 nurses. Quarantine, they'd said. She didn't see these worms the idiot in the room with her claimed to see, and she'd been right there the whole time. The phone rang. Dr. James picked it up, his face still as pale as when Kara stopped hurling the yellow liquid and flatlined.
Okay? You sure?
He asked.
I know what I saw. They have to have gone somewhere. Keep looking.
There were no worms.
Gina said as he hung up the phone.
I saw them.
You're the only one. Why didn't I see them? Are those 2?
She pointed at the nurses who wore headphones as they watched a soap opera on the tiny television mounted to the wall.
I don't know,
he said as he walked towards the bank of windows flanking their bed.
But I saw them. Thousands all over her belly and on my scrubs. They were on the floor and crawling from her eyes. Why would her eyes bleed like that if nothing burst the vessels behind them?
It isn't a stroke, like a bleed in the brain. That could cause bleeding.
And I'm a doctor,
he reminded her.
I know what can and can't happen. There were worms in her eyes. Her husband had just returned from Africa. Maybe he picked up some kind of parasite. Whatever it is, whether you saw it or not, we have to contain it.
Gina's neck tickled. She rubbed it. A twitch irritated her left eye. It had come and gone several times in the past 3 days. It was annoying. Gave her a headache occasionally. Caused a dark line in her vision. She laid back against her pillows.
I'd have seen them. I was right beside you.
He shrugged.
They're almost finished cleaning the room. If they find nothing there, they'll run scans on all of us. If there's still nothing, then we'll be released.
She rubbed her eye. It twitched with more force.
And your worm theory?
If it's a parasite, which is possible, then maybe the larvae disintegrate when exposed to air. I can't say for sure, but something made them sick. Kara's husband's autopsy showed elevated protein levels in his blood. And there was a necrotic tissue in his stomach. They're examining the fluid from Kara's body as well.
What does that mean?
It's not normal. We don't know what it means yet, though.
Gina didn't know what to believe. She saw nothing in Kara's vomit, and she got a face full of it. Swallowed some before backing away. God, it was so gross. She'd never seen anyone puke like that before. If that's what Sam did, no wonder Kara was so distraught. Lost her damn mind. And now, the medical staff was doing the same. Her eye throbbed now. She pressed her palm against it, wishing they'd just let her out of this stuffy room. Frank would make sure Felix was taken care of, but he didn't like the poor dog. Wouldn't give him the affection Gina did. Poor Felix must miss her terribly.
Gina?
She heard the doctor's voice but ignored him. The throbbing now moved down her face, into her throat. Her stomach felt impossibly full. Christ, maybe Kara had some kind of flu bug. Did that mean she'd vomit so hard she stroked out too?
Gina?
Dr. James said again. Shit. Mary! Call a code! Shuffling. Gina felt like clawing her eye out might be a good solution, but she knew that was insane. Still, her hand curled, fingers dug into the soft flesh of her eyelid. Her stomach twisted, and the fullness crept upward. She opened her mouth to tell Dr. James she felt ill, but a violent burst of heat stole her words. She saw the vomit, felt its warm moisture on her chest and her legs, but couldn't stop its ejection from her body. Her eye felt like it popped, and the tickling sensation returned. It moved around her eyeball, then down to her cheek. She looked down, and finally, she saw the worms. Her scream was drowned out by the vomit, and more worms. Dr. James shouted. She felt hands on her shoulders, her head. Christ, there were thousands of them. And then something popped deep within her brain. The worms vanished, and it was quiet.